Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to those of you who've been listening in to this series of lectures on the traditional religious narrative and counter-narrative as it relates to religion and the state within the Islamic discourse. And specifically, we're looking at the understanding of this discourse by one scholar, one Islamic scholar, Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, who I've spoken about in earlier recordings as part of this series. And we're looking at some of the ideas that he put forth in 2015 in some articles, and then a series of lectures that actually took place in the city of Dallas. We had left off in the last session with coming now to a conclusion as to what the traditional narrative is. So by way of summary, at this point we've come through determining that there is this traditional religious narrative around religion and the state. We've talked about some of the key personalities, the key scholars that have helped shape it, because the way in which they impacted the world was not so much in any particular field, like law or hadith. They were certainly impactful in those ways, but by presenting a total, complete vision with regard to the faith. And there we spoke about the Sufi vision, we spoke about a Salafi vision, Ibn Taymiyyah with the Salafi, Imam Ghazali with the Sufi, we spoke about Shah Waliullah, we spoke about Maulana Maududi. And Ghamidi Sahib has pulled these four individuals from the Islamic intellectual heritage to say these four certainly had precursors, certainly there were other major scholars, but these four, in the sort of vision that they put forward, have been hugely impactful and influential. Right? And part of what we started to get at was, all right, well, what are the main salient features in their narratives? Because what Ghamidi Sahib points out is that despite the fact that there's a Sufi approach, Salafi approach, this kind of combined approach from Shah Waliullah, and then the political Islam type of approach from Maududi, that when it comes to religion and the state, when it comes to the relationship of Islam and the state, that they're essentially on the same page, that they essentially believe the same thing, and that is this sort of unified traditional narrative. They may have disagreements in sort of parts of it. There may be areas where they are sort of off or like opposed to each other. But essentially the narrative is the same. And he believes this, he points to these individuals and that are coming from the Sunni tradition, but he believes that this is the same case, Sunni and Shi'i. Right? With, again, differences within Shi'i discourse as it relates to the role of the Imam, right, or the Imams. But essentially the same notion, the same idea of what the relationship between Islam and the state should be. Now, when he talks about it, he also points out, as we noted, or I noted in the last session, that essentially what it comes down to is that the argument that they are making within the traditional narrative about this relationship of Islam and the state is one that is premised upon the historical record from the first generation of Muslims, particularly the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, the companions and the successors. That historical record, what is considered essentially established history. There's no denying it, that this is the historical record. It's not an anecdotal occurrence that may have not happened. It's not some isolated incident that some people have reported that we don't know full about. No, this established history, that becomes a source for religion, right? So within that, this connects back to how he gets to the 5 main points within the traditional narrative. The 5 main points that are at the heart of the traditional narrative. The idea of eradicating shirk, kufr, and apostasy. The idea of jihad, the concept of jihad and its role within this. The notion of establishing a caliphate. The idea that the state must have a role in implementing law and making sure that Muslim practice, that Muslims are obeying religious law, that Muslims are practicing Islam, that they have a role and responsibility in ensuring that. And then finally, they have a role and responsibility in correcting Muslim belief. All of these things are part of the traditional narrative with regard to the relationship of Islam and the state. And where does that come from? Its main source ends up being the historical record. And then, as Ghamidi Sahib notes, that historical record gets supplemented by scholars, at times by the Quran and the Sunnah, say, yes, this occurred, and look, here, there's also something in the Quran that supports this. But secondarily, the historical record serves as the manifestation of the legal directives that Muslims should follow. Now, we see that then in what happened with the Sahaba and the Tabi'in in the Arabian Peninsula. That they went out and went through this process of trying to eradicate shirk and kufr and dealt with apostasy, right? And you see in the example, for instance, of Abu Bakr bin Siddiq, right? Who ends up right after the Prophet's death, peace be upon him, you see Sayyidina Abu Bakr come in and he has to deal with all these folks who are leaving the faith. And he goes there and makes sure, he says, it is imperative for me to deal with this type of apostasy. History, in essence, then becomes decisive in Ghamdi's view from the standpoint of the traditional narrative. For Ghamdi, history plays a decisive role within the traditional narrative. Historical fact, in essence, almost has this power that is indisputable, in a way that the Quran and Hadith may have different interpretations by different folks, but if something occurred historically, you might have a disagreement as to like, oh, you know, it wasn't riding a camel, it was riding a horse, or some like thing like that. But the historical event itself, when it's established history, there's no disagreement on it. And so in that sense, Ghamidi Sahib says, it can be an even more powerful source. It can be an even more powerful source than Quran and Sunnah, where there may be dispute. And he says, or disagreement. And he says that gives you a sense of the strong role it plays within this narrative. It gives you a sense of why the Salafi position can be so strong, because for the Salafis, they're very explicit about that being really sort of a basis upon which the Sharia is understood. As an example, Ghamidi Sahib mentions that, what do we mean by established history? Well, he says, look, generally, it's been accepted that you can shorten prayers and you can combine them, right? Shortening of prayers has been mentioned in the Quran, but it's really been brought up in the context of warfare. You know, combining prayers, he says, it's not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, but there is an allusion to it, that it becomes evident from later verses in the Quran. So there's also sort of permission for this. And there's some disagreement as to how these permissions apply, etc. Some say It should be restricted to the context of warfare, etc., etc. There's hadith that indicate the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, expanded it beyond the context of warfare. But in addition to these sources, in addition to the Quran, the Sunnah, and sort of what we've described there, there's also a historical event that occurs and continues to occur that is in support of this, that ends up becoming a source for this. When you go from Mina to Arafat and then Muzdalifah, during Hajj, then shortening and combining prayers sort of comes forward in almost its true form. Thousands of people do this. And once this event occurs, then it's part of the historical record. There's no need to do any research as to like whether it happens or not, or whether it should or how. That's now a historical event, Ghamidi Sahib says, and that then becomes established history, right? Something, he says, that may be in the Quran and Sunnah, but when it becomes lived reality, when it becomes part of history, then it takes on this sense of being undisputed, right? Undisputed. And certainly Muslims will say, yeah, the Quran is undisputed. Yes, of course. Or the Sunnah is undisputed, sure. But there are disagreements, there are different interpretations, etc. But with established history, oftentimes that's just not the case. It's just accepted fact. That is how it's treated, right? Okay. No interpretation then becomes necessary because everybody knows it, right? It's something that's generally known, and there's really nothing left to debate. And there's certainly going to be folks who might oppose that reality, even a reality that they themselves are seeing. But Ghamidi Sahib says that those people are oftentimes dismissed as being folks who are so caught up in their stubbornness about a historical event being a certain way, the way they want to understand it, that they refuse to see anything else. But they're dismissed, he says, as just being overly stubborn. Because if something has gained that sense of being established history, it becomes indisputable. Okay. Now you take this idea and then you begin to apply it to the Islamic past. And you see, okay, it's established history, isn't it? Ghamidi Sahib says that after the Prophet's death, the Sahaba went, they conquered various territories, they engaged in jihad, and they basically gave people options. Either you accept Islam, you pay the jizya, or we fight. That's established history, right? That happened. There's no dispute that that didn't happen. And then you get a conclusion from that. All right, that's established history. Well, what does that mean then? What does that mean? If it becomes a source, if it becomes a source of law, then in some respects that has to be emulated. Right? Within the traditional narrative, if the historical record is a source, then it requires emulation in the way, with regard to the Quran or the Sunnah, where you take those things as directives. So the key thing that Ghamidi Sahib is pointing out is that the traditional narrative looks at the historical record as being a series of directives with regard to Muslim behavior and action today. That it is not simply something that's part of the past, but that it is instructive. That it is instructive on the method, the way, the path to be followed today. Right? In the same way, everyone's in agreement that the Quran is that the Sunnah is that. Right? And both those things provide religious directive. But the addition of the historical record as something that is providing religious directive, that established history provides religious directive, is something that he says is at the heart of the traditional narrative. And so from that we get this notion that kufr, disbelief, cannot gain dominion because it didn't in the past, right? That there needs to be subjugation of the non-Muslim, and that's what jizya ended up representing, right? Some people in the modern period, others will sort of suggest, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, will make the suggestion that, oh, the jizya was just a type of tax. And this is, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, just their attempt at explaining away a historical fact that they believe in theory needs to be replicated in some way in the modern, in a modern Islamic government because it's a directive. That historical record is a directive. It serves as instruction. But they, in order for it to exist in the modern context, they need to look at it from a different way because it doesn't jive. It doesn't sort of fully fall in line with their modern sensibilities. And so they say, oh, jizya is a type of tax. When in fact, they know full well it's not. It's not based upon, it's not like zakat, it's not based upon your wealth. It's not based upon your particular sort of what income you're taking in or everything else. No, it's not. It's based on your status as a non-Muslim, right? And so how it existed in the past, and that's not the discussion here, it's sort of, we've talked in previous sessions about you have to understand the pre-modern sort of context and the notions of conquering and all of these things that existed or were part of the medieval world. Islam wasn't unique in that sense of like gaining territory and having, people from other communities that were now under them, etc. That wasn't unique, that was everywhere, right? And so, but our way of approaching it within the traditional narrative is to try to say, well, if that historical record and what the Sahaba did and the Tabi'een did, if everything they did, and it needs to be in some respects instructive, then we need to reframe it in a particular way. In a similar way, he says, this is how the establishing of the caliphate functions, right? It's something they look in the past, in the traditional narrative, and say, hey, this occurred. The caliphate was there. It was established. And then the Sahaba went about expanding it. And so, historically, it's been expanding. And it needs to expand because part of the traditional narrative is like, they can't give space for kufr, for disbelief to have dominion anywhere. Like kufr cannot have political power. Disbelief cannot have political power. And so expansion certainly had to occur. And in some respects, it needs to continue to if that's the instructive model. It's presently stopped for a variety of reasons. But that does not mean, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, for the traditional narrative, he says, like for the traditional narrative, that doesn't mean that expansion is not part of an aspiration, right? And this is where he goes in previous sessions, we talked about the fact that he talks about scholars all understanding this, right? Those who are wedded to this traditional narrative understand that the caliphate is the eventual goal. We may be in a period of nation states, but they're essentially in agreement that, okay, for the time being, we need these different nation states, these Muslim nation states. We need to focus on making them more Islamic. We need to focus on fixing them, almost as parts of the eventual caliphate. But that eventuality, that goal of establishing that caliphate is still there lurking. It may be way, way back in their minds, but it's still there. And he talks about Maududi Sahib, explicitly stating this in the sort of aftermath of an election loss where his political party whose goal was to do this type of fixing and reforming of Pakistan to make it more Islamic, where they suffered a significant loss. And in that speech, he harkens back to where the sort of origins of the Jamaat-e-Islami are, what's that background they're coming from. And the Khilafah, the Caliphate, is present there. Similarly, as part of the traditional narrative, there's this notion of implementing religious law, that the state has a responsibility to implement religious law. And from that perspective, we look at the time of Sayyidina Umar, for instance, where he was involved in the minutiae of religious practice of his believers. And if he was involved, that's part of established history. That means that has to occur now. So if Sayyidina Umar did it in that way, then it means that an Islamic government today has to do it, according to the traditional narrative. Right? Ghamidi Sahib notes this occasion as an example where Sayyidina Umar was giving the khutbah and Sayyidina Uthman shows up and he's late. He's late to Jummah. He comes to the masjid. And Sayyidina Umar stops in the middle of the khutbah and asks him, why are you late? And Sayyidina Uthman says, it's whatever, running late, etc., and I needed to do wudu. To which Sayyidina Umar responds, you came having just done wudu? You didn't do ghusl? Which is preferred before Jummah? Right? So the idea that from the minbar, the Khalifa, the Caliph, is involved in correcting the religious practice of one believer, stops the khutbah in order to do that. That being part of the established record. For the traditional narrative, that is instructive. Right? That is instructive as to practice today. Okay. So this is what Ghamidi Sahib is speaking of. He's talking about the fact that history, established history, that becomes undeniable, right? It becomes undeniable, and then it becomes instructive as a source for the traditional narrative, right? And that creates a particular mindset that looks at the world in that way. That history functions as a reality that cannot be denied, but is a source as well on its own. A source of religious law, of religious directive. And the traditional narrative and the religious mindset that it creates takes that as a jumping off point and constructs their vision of what needs to occur in present times on that basis. For Ghamidi Sahib, there are reasons for why this happened. There are consequences of this. And in his view then, there is a suggestion which then he puts into play that this has veered off path. That in fact, this is not how the relationship between Islam and the state should be understood. And so having laid all that out as to what this narrative is, we now begin the journey into Javed Ghamidi's counter-narrative. What is it that he's going to present as a counter to this, and where does that come from? Inshallah, we'll take that up in the next session. وقولي قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين والحمد لله رب العالمين.